Hey everybody, Mike Iaconelli back out here in the shop with a brand new video for you today. And in today's shop, I'm going to be answering a question that has come through so many times, I can't even tell you. And the basic question is, what is the best pre-spawn bass lure ever created? You know, what is the best lure for me to fish in the pre-spawn period? Man, that's a broad question. It's a really broad question, depending on the type of lake, depending on where you live. But when I looked at it, there were a couple lure choices that always went to the front. For sure, a chatterbait was up toward the front. A jig was up toward the front. A lipless vibration and a suspended jerkbait were up toward the front. But when the question says, what was the best lure of all times for the pre-spawn period? This one right here had to get the nod. And what I'm showing you right here is a general lure type, which is a crankbait. A crankbait, AKA a plug. If you're old, we used to call them plugs back in the day. But a crankbait, in my opinion, is the best pre-spawn bass lure ever created. Before we get into the whys of why this is the best pre-spawn lure ever created, let's talk about the pre-spawn real quick. And what does the pre-spawn mean? And in general, you know, the pre-spawn period is the time when the bass are moving from their winter hideouts, their winter positioning, and they're moving toward where they're gonna spawn eventually, right? So it's a period of transition. The pre-spawn means fish that are moving and feeding, transitioning to where they're eventually gonna spawn. So when you think about that pre-spawn, you know, good things to remember in your mind are, where did the fish winter? If you know that, right? You kind of look and say, oh, they wintered over there at the dam or on a main lake point or on that channel bend, deep channel bend, bluff bank, right? That's where they wintered. And then you can look up there and say, where are they gone to spawn? Look at that big flat, that protected pocket, the back of the creek, right? And when you know where they wintered and you have an idea where they spawned, you're going to follow that route in between those two areas, okay? The fish are going to be transient. Pre-spawn bass are synonymous with moving toward the spawning grounds. But here's where this comes into key. This is a key factor. You ready? Pre-spawn bass are also synonymous with stopping and staging. And some of the days that I've had with a crankbait in the pre-spawn have been the best fishing days of my life. I mean, times when you could cast out a crankbait and get bit on every cast or every other cast. 20, 30, 40 fish days off of one spot a lot of times in the pre-spawn. That's incredible. That's magic, okay? So pre-spawn, leaving the winter, heading toward the spawning grounds. On their way, they're following break lines, right, as they move. They're stopping on little key places to feed. That's the other thing, right? Pre-spawn, man, all winter, times were tough. The water was cold. Forage was hard to come by. They didn't want to expend a lot of energy. But as the water warms in the pre-spawn, the fish get a little more wired up, their metabolism's getting faster, and they want to eat. So as those fish are stopping and traveling and stopping, they're feeding. That's another reason this crankbait is so good. We're going to talk about all that in a second. Last thing I want to mention about the pre-spawn, no matter where you live, the winter water temperatures were the coldest water temperatures of the year. The pre-spawn water temperatures It's marked by rising water temperatures. And to me, pre-spawn water temperatures are like lower to mid 50s, rising to that magic 60-degree mark, right? I get out there, if the water temperature was 45 all winter long, and I drop the trolling motor, and all of a sudden I see 51-degree water, 52-degree water. If it's been 50 degrees all winter long, I drop the trolling motor in the spring, and I see 55, 56-degree water temperature, right? So pre-spawn's rising water temperature, and it generally happens, depending on where you live, from February all the way through like April, or even as late as May in some of the North Country, right? But pre-spawn fish, they're moving, they're stopping, they're feeding. Still can be some moderately cool water. They're all reasons why the crankbait gets my nod. Now, before we get into some specifics, look behind me here real quick, and I pulled out some boxes of some of my favorite crankbaits. And there's so many good crankbaits out there, guys, by a lot of different companies. But I'm a huge fan of the DT series, especially the DT 4, 6, 8, and 10. 14 is a good one, 16 is a good one. The DT series and the Rapala flat sides, which are the OG slim flat sides in both sizes, okay? And the reason I like the DTs and the flat sides in the pre-spawn is because these baits have a tighter wobble, okay? A tighter wobble. So remember, in the pre-spawn, the water's still, it's warming, but it's still cool, right? It's still colder. It's, you know, low 50s to 60 degree, that magic 60-degree mark, a little over 60. That's still moderately cool water. And because of that, I want you to pick a crankbait that has a tight wobble. I don't care about what brand. The DTs and the OG Slims are great. But whatever brand you pick, choose one that has a tighter vibration, right? A more subtle action to it. Because again, we're trying to match the activity level of the fish, right? They're still a little lethargic. They're coming out of that winter mode. They're staging. Okay, so pick a tight wobble crankbait. The other great thing about the DT series, and this is something I want you to do no matter what crankbait brand you use, is DT, in the name DT, means dives to. So when I say DT4, it dives to 4 feet. DT6 dives to 6 feet. DT8 to 8, DT10, and so on and so forth, right? I want you to pick, in the pre-spawn period, I want you to pick a crankbait that runs as deep or slightly deeper than the water depth that you're fishing, okay? So when you get out there and you drop your trolling motor and you're on a secondary point heading back into a pocket where you know they're going to spawn, right? Little secondary point comes out, there's a creek channel that swings by it, and when you drop your trolling motor, you're in 4 or 5 foot of water on top of that secondary point. DT6 is perfect, right? It dives as deep or a hair deeper than the depth you're fishing. Because one of the keys to this crankbait in the pre-spawn is its ability to create a reaction strike, okay? In the pre-spawn, you're going to have days when they're actively feeding, and to be honest, it doesn't matter what you're throwing, they'll bite it. There are those days, but a lot of days in the pre-spawn, remember our time, right? February, March, April. A lot of time in that spring period, dude, you get cold fronts from the north, a lot. They're coming down like every other week. And you have a lot of turbid weather conditions in the spring where fish aren't actively feeding. They're still grouped up, right? They still want to head to the spawning ground. They're still going to stop on those points and secondary points, but they're not actively feeding. No better bait in the pre-spawn does a better job of eliciting a reaction strike than a crankbait. And it does it when the crankbait changes direction. Okay? Listen, knowing that, what do you want to do every time you cast a crankbait out in the pre-spawn? You want to make it change direction, right? Every time I throw this, I don't want it just coming back in steady. I want this bait either deflecting, hitting off something, or I want to use my rod and my reel to make it stop, change direction, pause, right? I always want this thing changing direction because the change in movement of that bait is what causes that reaction strike. And it's so good in the pre-spawn with a crankbait. So by picking a crankbait that runs as deep or deeper than the water you're fishing, by default, you're going to be hitting the bottom. Hitting the bottom is good with a crankbait because every time you hit, it changes direction. You also want to make sure that you're purposely fishing it into the cover. You're purposely deflecting it into cover. So on hard objects in the pre-spawn, that could be a rock, it could be a stump, it could be a log, it could be a brush pile down there on that point. Those targets are going to hold the fish. And when that crankbait in the pre-spawn comes by that log or that stump and it goes tunk and it hits off and deflects and turns, that's when they bite it. Even soft cover in the pre-spawn. And I love soft cover. And by soft cover, I mean grass, vegetation. Soft cover in the pre-spawn is tremendous. Outside edge of hydrilla, inside line of milfoil, right? Scattered eelgrass. Fish love to stop on that as they move toward the spawning grounds. Even in grass, I want this crankbait to change direction. And I purposely fish it into the edge of the grass. And if that hydrilla or milfoil has an edge to it, I like to get that crankbait and quarter cast the edge, and I purposely want to get it caught in the grass, and then I rip it out with my rod. And that ripping motion, that popping free out of the grass, creates that reaction bite, right? Last but not least, open water, times when there's nothing to hit off of. You can't hit off a stump, there's no rocks, you can't hit off the bottom the whole cast, and there's no grass, it's open water. Fish still use open water in the pre-spawn. Make that bait change direction with your rod and your reel, right? So you make that cast out there, wind it down, let it get down to that diving depth, and then change your retrieve speed. Stutter stop it, throw pauses into it, change your rod positioning. Crank high, crank low, crank high, crank middle. And when you do all those changes, even in open water, that crankbait's going to change direction. And it's going to create so many reaction bites for you in the pre-spawn, I can't tell you, okay? All right, so we talked about the crankbait. We talked about you want a tight wobble. We wanted it running as deep or deeper, a little deeper than the depth you're fishing. We talked about how important it is in the pre-spawn to make sure that crankbait's changing direction. All right? I want to mention color real quick, and then I want to get to the rod, the reel, and the line, and then we're going to wrap up, okay? Here's my rule of thumb on color in the pre-spawn. The easiest way for me to explain this is just by opening this box up. Let me get my DT6s. And here's my rule of thumb on color. And if you've listened to my shop videos before, you know what I'm going to tell you. You ready? The number one rule in picking crankbait color in the pre-spawn is matching the hatch. I want you to pick that crankbait color based on the forage that's around during the pre-spawn. And the interesting thing is that as you look in this box of DT6s, I got a lot of crankbaits in there but I don't have a lot of colors. I've got what I call the 3 basic food groups, okay? The 3 basic food groups are represented in this box, and I'm going to show them to you. You want some crankbaits in the pre-spawn that represent bait fish forage, right? Shad, minnows, alewife, herring, bluebacks, shiners, right? You want some that imitate your bait fish colors. You want some that imitate your bluegill or your perch, your yellow perch, right? Panfish species, so some brighter chartreuses. And then, last but not least, God, this is a killer in the spring. You want crankbaits in the pre-spawn that represent crawfish. Some of these natural crawl patterns, regular original crawl, we got a mule color in there. And of course, we've got the demon color, that red, which does an excellent job of imitating crawfish in the pre-spawn period. There's something special about these crawfish colors in the pre-spawn. And I'm not a scientist, but one of my guesses is that because they've come out of that wintertime period and they're hungry and they know they have to feed up heavy before they go spawn. Because when they spawn, they're expending a tremendous amount of energy on the spawning ritual, right? I believe that they go out of their way to target crawfish in the pre-spawn. So your crawfish colors, original crawfish, the DT Demon color, unbelievable in the pre-spawn. All right, last but not least, talk about rod, reel, line a little bit and why there's specialty tackle here for fishing that crankbait in the pre-spawn. And again, this whole video is about what's the best pre-spawn lure ever created. It's right here, man. It's crankbait. We're going to throw a crankbait on specialized tackle to help us hook and land more fish, okay? Let's start with the rod. I want you to use a 7 to 7.5 foot medium action parabolic rod, all right? Specifically, I'll tell you what the rod is I use, but I'll show you the action of the rod, okay? A 7 to 7.5 foot medium action parabolic rod. My all-time favorite is this one right here. It's an Abu Garcia Ike Series 7.3 medium, which is right in the middle of that range I told you about. But here's the key. And by the way, this Abu Ike Series delay rod is composite, which means this particular rod is graphite and glass mixed together. But here's the main thing I want you to look at. If you're watching this video and you use Shimano or Daiwa or Loomis or St. Croix, whatever rod you're using, 13 Fishing, whatever rod you're using, medium action parabolic. Look how spongy the tip of that rod is. I mean, from the tip to about halfway down the rod is pretty flimsy. Look at that. You see it? It's pretty flexible. It's pretty parabolic. But from halfway down the rod to the butt, it's pretty solid, right? You still want some backbone back there. You don't want the whole thing to be whippy, but you want about half of the rod to exhibit that spongy parabolic tip. And what that's going to do with this crankbait, this plug in the pre-spawn, it's going to let you make super long casts. You got to have long casts because of diving depth, right? We want this to hit and deflect. So that rod, that soft rod is going to load like a rubber band, right? So casting distance, but here's the big one. You ready? Delay in hook set. Because when that fish is sitting down there on that secondary point on that lone stump and it deflects and he really doesn't want it, but he sort of reacts on it, when he starts to touch the bait, you feel it. And your tendency is to pull back, right? But we want to let that fish get the bait. And so a medium action parabolic rod acts as a delay, right? That's why we call this Ike series rod the delay series, composite, because it adds delay. So even when I set the hook, watch, ready? It takes a second for the tip to catch up with the bait, right? And that, even if it's a fraction of a second, that fraction of a second allows that fish to get the bait fully in his mouth before we set the hook. So delay. And the last thing this very parabolic medium action rod is going to do, it's going to allow us to land more fish. You know, how many times in the pre-spawn, cold wintertime period, did they react on it? They really didn't want it. They sort of headbutted it. And you've got them hooked by one little hook, right? And you get them close to the boat and they're going nuts. They're going crazy. They're jumping, they're diving. If we had a very stiff rod, a heavy action rod, or a medium heavy action rod, when that fish dives or jumps, it has a tendency, because there's no give to the rod, for the hooks to pull out. But in the pre-spawn, when they're fighting like crazy and that fish dives or jumps, right? Look what that spongy parabolic rod does. Watch, ready? It gives to the fish. So we're going to land a lot more fish by using that specialty rod, okay? 7.5 foot medium action parabolic rod, okay? Next thing's the reel. Then we'll get to line, then we'll be finished. With the reel, because this is the pre-spawn, okay? Think about the pre-spawn again. Fish leaving their winter, heading to spawn. They're moving, they're stopping, they're feeding. But guess what? At the end of the day, they're still a little lethargic. We're not talking about 65, 70, 80, 90 degree water here. We're talking about water temperature that's 50, 55, 58. Because of that, we want a slower gear ratio reel. Slower gear ratio reel. I want you to use a casting reel, low profile casting reel that has a 6:1 to 7:1 gear ratio. I would call that middle of the road to slower for today's reel market, right? 6:1 to 7:1. Specifically, this is at Abu Garcia Revo Ike, and we make it in a 6:1 gear ratio. That is 27.5 inches per turn of the reel handle. 6:1 gear ratio. Really a great retrieve speed. Because that time of the year with the water being cooler, we want a more methodical retrieve. And that lower gear ratio is going to force us to slow down a little bit and be more deliberate with the crankbait, okay? So 6:1 to 7:1, a slower, more moderate gear ratio on the reel. Last but not least, let's talk about line. And there are two line types I'm going to fish with the crankbait during the pre-spawn, and they are fluorocarbon and monofilament. I would say my breakdown ratio is about 75-25. 75% of the time in the pre-spawn with a crankbait, with a plug, I'm going to use straight fluorocarbon. Look at it, all the way to the knot on the reel. Straight fluorocarbon. And the reason is fluorocarbon is invisible. It's pretty abrasion resistant. It's got a little stretch. We'll talk about that in a second. It's got a little stretch. It's not zero stretch, but it's got a little bit. And most of all, fluorocarbon is dense. Fluorocarbon is dense. It sinks. And a dense sinking line on a crankbait in the pre-spawn means deeper diving depths, right? Remember, we want to hit the bottom. We want to contact stuff. So I'm going to be able to get this to its maximum diving depth. But it also means better action. So that DT on fluorocarbon has a more natural, tighter action than it does on other line types, okay? So 75% of the time, especially when I want to get a crankbait deeper, fluorocarbon. The other 25% of the time, I'm going to throw a crankbait on mono. And the reason I do that is because I want the crankbait to stay shallower. And in the pre-spawn, for sure, there are times when we want to get our crankbait to run a little shallower. Toward the last part of the pre-spawn, when they get in, 1 to 4 or 5 foot of water, and we want to keep it higher, we're around a massive stump field. But especially if we're fishing around grass, mono will help you keep that bait a little bit higher and a little bit out of the grass. You're still going to get in it, but not bury as deep. So mono floats. And the other thing mono has that fluorocarbon has, and a little more than fluoro, look at this, you ready? It's stretchy. Mono has a lot of stretch to it. And you want stretch. I want to go back to that one. Fluorocarbon and mono both have stretch. You want stretch. This is why we're not going to use superline in the pre-spawn. And we want stretch because we want delay. Just like with the rod, we want that fish to get it all the way in his mouth. So with a spongy rod tip and with a little stretch of the line, it's just a little more, just a fraction of a second more delay to let that fish get the bait, okay? So fluorocarbon, monofilament, it's the right line to use in the pre-spawn. Man, I hope you enjoyed this one. It was definitely a tough choice picking the absolute best all-time lure for the pre-spawn. But without a doubt, I can confidently tell you that a crankbait, a tight wobble crankbait, gets the nod. Man, if you like this episode, do me a favor, mash that subscribe button. Become a subscriber to my channel. We're going to get you great content pieces every single week. If you're already subscribed to Mike Iaconelli Fishing on YouTube, do me a favor. Tell your buddies, tell your fishing friends about the channel. We're here to educate. Tie your crankbait on, a plug on in the pre-spawn, go to cranking, and you're going to have a great time. See you later.